Welcome again, and for the last lecture by Brian. Those who were here yesterday must be full of expectations of what is going to happen today, and those that are here the first two times will by now realize these are extraordinary lectures. So without further ado, let me just give the microphone to Brian for the last lecture in the series, the W. Brian Arthur Lectures.
Thank you very much. I think actually of these as the Sidney Brenner lectures, which they were last year, and I'm honored to take part. So far I've been talking a couple of times about the economy and once about complexity, and I want to change the topic this morning and talk about technology. It looks to be a completely different subject, and maybe it is. And there's a bit of a challenge for me because I find that most of my audience is very often people who understand the social sciences and economics, and they glaze over a little bit when it comes to technology. Once I gave a talk in Prof. Su Guaning's class to engineers, and they all sat up straight, and they were all terribly interested because I was talking engineering. So I do want to talk about engineering today. This is the last lecture, the fourth in the series. I am grateful to everyone who came. And I did promise early on that I would make comments along the way on how research works, how it might work, what my own experiences have been. I haven't done that so far too much, but at the end I do want to throw in some comments on what I think works very well, at least well for me, and very likely for you as well, towards the end. So today I want to talk about technology. And first of all, why did I get interested in this? I went to university, I was pretty young, I had just turned 17. The university was in Belfast, rigorous engineering university. I did 4 years of nothing but engineering. It's not like the US system where you are allowed to civilize yourself along the way. It was mathematics, physics, engineering, mathematics, physics for 4 years. And at the end of the fourth year, I knew a lot, theoretically at least, about engineering. I knew a lot about technology. I knew how jet engines worked, and I knew how electronics worked and power stations, and I knew mathematics sort of out to here. And I'm sure a lot of you have had the same experience or parallel experiences. And I did quite well. I did very well on the exams, mostly because this was electrical engineering, and that's basically a form of mathematics. So I did very well. Got a first-class honors, came top of the class, etc. But I realized I had no clue what engineering was all about. I didn't even know what technology was about after 4 years. I'm not blaming the university. I'm just saying that after all that study, I didn't quite know what engineering was about. And maybe other folks have the same feeling. You could study an awful lot of medicine and not quite know what doctoring was about, or possibly even philosophy. You could study all the philosophers you want, but you're not quite sure what it really means to think deeply about some issue in philosophy yourself. Anyway, that's where I found myself. I thankfully changed over to become a mathematician, and then applied mathematician, and then an economist. But the thought stuck with me, what was technology really? And we'd been told a lot of things. We were told it was vaguely the way society satisfies its needs. and it was applied science, it was this, it was that. None of those seemed very satisfactory to me. I dropped the whole idea, and I started to study economics in grad school in Berkeley, but then the whole question came up again because I was interested in economic development, and it became very clear to me that an economy develops as its technologies develop. Russia starts to develop in the 1830s as the railroads come in. It starts to develop as it has steelworks, etc. These are all technologies. Economies don't develop just because people have different thoughts. They develop when people can do things more efficiently, much better, often by orders of magnitude. So the economy basically is an expression of its technologies. But what were the technologies? So I was back at the same question. Early on in this project, I started to think about technology, and I started to get seriously interested, and people asked, what are you working on these days? I said, technology. And that was greeted always by stares. Technology. Yeah, I suppose, yes, why technology? And I wondered if, for me, this was just instinct. I'm sure a lot of you do research through instinct, but I was instinctively interested in technology. I couldn't quite explain why. So then I did a thought experiment. I thought, what if I woke up one morning, or you woke up, maybe you live in some apartment in Singapore, you wake up one morning, and let's say for this thought experiment, you sort of wake up and you're staggering towards your espresso machine or whatever it is, and all the technologies have disappeared. All the technologies set for the last 700 years. Suddenly, whoop, you find you're on the ground floor, there's no high rises. You try to go to the toilet has disappeared. It didn't exist before the 1800s. There's no coffee machine. You want to get in your car, there's no cars. All the technologies disappear. Joint stock companies disappear. Engineering marvels disappear. Bridges disappear. All the things that make our modern life. And if 700 years worth of technologies disappear, that would take, at least in the West, that would take out printing, so there's no books, etc. You could say, I tell you what, if you want to get real, no smartphones, no nothing. And you wake up and you're back to the technologies of the 1300s. You still have your spouse, you still have your children, you still have all your thoughts, all the science training you want, but no technology except water wheels and mills, and you know how to build temples, because that's an old technology. You know how to build cathedrals if you're in Europe. You have coarse linen, you have hoodies in those days, rail cloaks with hoods on them. But you're back in the Middle Ages. So it's technology, more than anything else, we could say. For us, we could say it was Christopher Columbus, it was Isaac Newton, it was modern science, it was this, that, and the other made the modern world. But more than anything else, it's technology. And then I started to think and realize that I said to people, well, I'm working on technology. And then I noticed people are vaguely uncomfortable. And I realized I was uncomfortable. We all have an unease about technology, and we have a kind of double feeling about technology. One of the feelings is that we place our hopes in technology. So if you're worried about, say, a pandemic breaking out or infectious diseases, it's okay, but we can fly in with technology, medical technology, clinics, etc. If you look at your own family, I can tell you this, the mortality, say, before 1900 or around about that time was really awful, and even almost in my generation. So your children are going to live a great deal longer. So, and this is due to technology. The reason we don't die is not quite modern medicine. We don't die young in our children. It's because we have clean water, we have modern sewage systems, and we have an ability to get food delivered. And for Singapore, I know that's a little bit of a question should things get really break down here. But you don't get famines like my ancestors had to live through in the 1840s. So it's all technology making that possible, and we've learned to put our hopes in technology. Oh, we live still longer. Maybe someone like me or you could live to be 100 or 120, technology. But we don't trust technology. And so when it comes to anything, stem cell technology, CRISPR technology, editing genes, artificial intelligence, there's this unease. We don't trust technology. We trust nature. More than anything, we've 3 million, 5 million years of humans living in nature. We're not very at home in that anymore. But if we have a new technology, the first thing we always ask is this natural? I remember I was taught German by a nun who had been born in the 1890s, 1891, and she was telling me that when trains first came along, people thought that the devil, this was in Austria, people thought that the devil rode in front of the locomotive. They didn't trust the technology. It wasn't natural. So we trust in nature and we hope in technology. And these two very deep unconscious feelings we have, is it natural? Can we trust it? But I'm hoping that this comes along, that comes along to make our lives better, make us survive longer. These things are like two big tectonic plates, trust versus hope, grinding away. And apart from politics and general lack of, let's euphemistically say, lack of wisdom among politicians, this really carries a lot of the story of our times. We can do this, but should we do this? We can put people in the moon, but should we be doing such and such? So we have very deep feelings about technology, quite unconscious. When I started to do this, or think about this project, people were saying, well, don't we know everything about technology? And I thought, well, somebody does, you know. Like, do we know anything about music? Well, different people know scores of particular composers. If you're a conductor, you know these scores intimately and you know how the whole thing should flow. But I began to realize that we, meaning fairly well-educated people, don't know that much about technology, even though individually technologies are extremely well understood. And I realized the situation was, where would I place technology, you know, in thought? It's a bit like biology around about 1790s, 1798. There's a marvelous biologist in France, Georges Cuvier. I don't see many nods here. I think he lived a little bit later than Erasmus Darwin, who was Darwin's grandfather. People at that time, many people, knowledgeable biologists and anatomists, believed vaguely in evolution, but they didn't have any mechanism. In fact, the mechanism by which speciation takes place came only with Darwin around about 1838, published 20 years later or so. So Georges Cuvier understood anatomy. He understood many different species. In the 1790s, all of this was intimately understood, but what was missing was general principles for technology. When I got into this, I don't think anyone gets into any big problem area without an idea. And two ideas were at the back of my mind in the 1990s. 1992, now this sounds terribly dated, but 26 years ago, so much for mathematical training. 26 years ago, I was learning C programming. Now that dates me. And I began to realize I also had a sort of hobby interest in studying jet engines. I don't know why. Always been fascinated by the fact that you can get into a tube of metal and sit there for a number of hours. You start west coast of America and you wind up at the tip of the Malaysian peninsula in Singapore. For me, this is miraculous. And so I was studying jet engines and I was studying C programs at the same time. And what struck me was that the two were the same. So let me explain. A C program works by having, in a C program, all the subroutines are called functions. There's one function at the center of a C program that's called main. It's the main function. It's always called main. And then hanging off this and making that work were subfunctions. And then making those subfunctions work in programming C were other subfunctions. You write all these yourself, or at least you pick them up from a library, and then making those subfunctions work were libraries of functions, and making those work, again, were individual operators like plus and minus and multiplication, etc. What about a jet engine? A jet engine has a central, one central rotating assembly. It has a compressor, so as air comes in, it's compressed up, sort of highly compressed air, and then fuel sprayed into that combusts, and that turns a turbine at the back, and the whole thing gives out a mass of high velocity air. So it's a bit like a balloon, you blow it up and a mass of air comes out the back and it goes all over the room. But what I noticed was that there was a main function for a jet engine. That's compression, combustion, and the turbine that drives the compressor. And hanging off this were other functions, getting the fuel to the engine, rotating the stators, doing things, controlling the blades of the compressor, controlling temperatures, lots of feedback, electronic systems to switch the whole thing, monitoring systems. So again, functions of functions. And I began to realize that this general architecture was there everywhere. There's, in a piece of music, and I don't want to oversimplify here, in a piece of music there might be a theme, and then there's parts that will carry that theme, then there's subparts, etc., right down to the instrumental parts. So again, a main function and then other functionalities or functions to make things work. We have this in programming, but it's in virtually all the technologies I know of. The other thing I noticed, and this was in the 1990s, I was doing this work on increasing returns, and I started to look at technologies. And I noticed something, and that was that all technologies consist of parts. They're all combinations of things that exist already. So if you take a random technology, I work at Xerox PARC in Palo Alto. They invented the laser printer. What's a laser printer? A laser printer is basically a computer processor that takes the image that you want to process and print on a piece of paper. It takes that, it feeds it in to controlling a laser beam. The laser beam paints, in the technical term, on the drum of a Xerox machine, and so it paints the image. The laser literally on the Xerox drum, and the rest is just copying, xerography. So it's a combination of a Xerox machine or a copying machine, a lot of optics, and computer processor, and a laser. How you get all that to work is I could tell you the story, but it's a long story, and almost all to do with one man called Gary Starkweather in about 1992 and 93. So I began to sort of vaguely see looming out of, for me, and maybe for you, all ideas. Some ideas come like that, but a lot of ideas kind of loom out of the fog. And I was beginning to see in the mid-90s the structure, the architecture of different technologies, much the same. And the technologies were all basically combinations. And instinctively, on the strength of that, I decided in 1997 I would write a book on technology. This is a stretch. I didn't really know that much. And I thought it would take a while. I'd have to do some studying. It took me 12 years, and nearly all that time was spent understanding individual technologies. I made some decisions. I thought there'd be no mathematics, there'd be no equations. I wasn't going to borrow from anybody. This would be from first principles. This was one of the best things I was ever taught, by the way, in grad school. My doctoral advisor, Stuart Dreyfus, who was a mathematician, I'd come in and I said, we can use this or we can use that, and we can do it in n dimensions. He said, no. Just sit down and figure it out in X and Y, and then come back and tell me why that works. So always go to first principles. I decided I'd think about technology from first principles. Maybe I would do a book on technology. I had no idea what the book would be, but vaguely I thought perhaps it should be how innovation works, how invention works, and is there any theory of evolution for technology? And I decided I had two models, and this sounds terribly grandiose, so this is very ambitious. There were two books I liked that I thought were beautifully written. One was The Origin of Species by Darwin. Darwin wasn't just a good naturalist. Darwin was a fantastic journalist or diarist. Wrote beautifully for his day, now a bit flowery for us, but really, really clear writer. I admired his book, really stating the key mechanism by which evolution took place. And he did, of course, he built upon Lyell and others who had shown that the Earth is unbelievably old, and he spent years in the field, in the Andes Mountains, etc., looking at fossils. He was an expert on beetles, more than anything. The other person I admired was Thomas Kuhn, who had written there's something of scientific revolutions. The what? Thank you. Structure of scientific revolutions. And again, he was taking example after example and then taking out principles. It didn't matter to me whether Darwin was right or Kuhn was right or wrong. I just admired the way they were going deeply, deeply into the world and into the real world and then extracting principles. So I decided, this is yet another decision, that I'm not going to lift ideas out of economics. Strangely, the people who really had studied technology were not engineers. They were historians, social scientists, occasionally anthropologists. If it was something like early pottery, anthropologists really knew what they were talking about, and economists. Not all economists, but a tiny, beleaguered band of economists thought about technology. I once went to lunch at Stanford with a superb engineer or engineering thinker. His name was Vincenti. I'm sure he's not alive anymore. This was quite a while ago. He was 94 at the time. And I said to him, but very distinguished, he was the man in the 1940s and 50s who figured out a lot about supersonic flight and made that work. That was cutting edge in the 1950s. I said to Walter Vincenti, I said, tell me, I said, what do engineers think about the foundations of their field? And Vincenti just went quiet. And then he looked a bit embarrassed, and I said, no. I said, look, have engineers studied the foundations of their field, and what are they saying? And he says, they haven't studied the foundations of their field, of what really engineering or technology is. There's quite a lot of work on the practice of engineering and individual technology. So he said, no, they haven't studied that. I said, why? He said, engineers like problems they can solve. And he looked at me with a fair amount of pity. I was going to try to take on this problem. So I began to notice, so I decided I would study about 20 technologies, 24 technologies, and know about a dozen extremely well. And I'd study their history, I'd study how they were put together. I would read what the originators of these technologies had to say. I would read lab books. And in fact, I remember calling up Joseph Sutter, who had been the chief engineer on the Boeing 747, and asked him, when you ran into this problem on the 747 in the 1960s, what did you do? And people like that were incredibly helpful. You could ask them questions. He was then in his 80s, and I got very, very good answers. The particular technologies I decided I needed to know about were maybe obvious ones: jet engines, steam engine, computers, calculators, radar. My bias was electrical engineering. Early radio, spark radio, but odd technologies like penicillin and how all that had come about, mass spectrograph. Silicon Valley itself, Silicon Valley isn't a technology, but I needed to know the history of one area. In fact, Silicon Valley doesn't go back to 1940s and 50s. It goes back to 1907, to Federal Telegraph, and it was established roughly then. The chief investor, you can probably guess, this is the VC, the venture capitalist. Chief one was Stanford University, which by then, 1907, was about 15 years old, maybe a bit older than that, the university. At any rate, I decided I would really get to know these technologies. I read books and books and books about the technologies. I read manuals. I read pilots' manuals about jet engines. It was really fun, and it's a bit hard, to take an audience that might be literary, social science, all of very different backgrounds. And I'm sitting in St. John's College in Santa Fe reading about radio engineering as written in the 1950s. And I'm going, wow, they did that? That's amazing. Wow, here's how this circuit, that's incredible. So for me, this was an amazingly happy time. I didn't have to think, I just had to understand. As I say, I didn't start a project like that and say I'm going to spend 12 years of my life trying to understand these technologies, but that's how it worked out. And I had, as I said, a pretty good background of 4 years of engineering, so the engineering or the mathematics weren't a challenge. The challenge was just to absorb all that. I don't want to be grandiose, but for me, the comparison was, I was going to write about some species or other, and I'd better learn to take it to pieces and figure out how it works. Perhaps giraffes or whales or something like that. One of the things that attracted me about technology and puzzled me was that there was vaguely a theory of evolution for technology. The theory of evolution for technology is quite weird. There's a literary figure and general eccentric called Samuel Butler in English history. Samuel Butler went to New Zealand around 1859 or so. I may have the year off slightly. He had an overbearing father, it's safe to say, and Butler went off. It's harder to get farther away from England than New Zealand. Butler goes off to New Zealand. A couple of years later, by ship, arrives a copy of Origin of Species. In fact, I think Butler's, now again, I should have checked my facts. Butler's grandfather had taught the young Darwin's father. I may not have the right generations there, certainly the grandfather. So Darwin's and the Butlers were slightly connected. Sam Butler reads Darwin's book, he gets all excited, and he wonders, could there be a theory of evolution for steam engines? And could you mate steam engines in the future? We haven't quite got to that, but with AI, with John Holland's genetic algorithm, we're getting there. Could you mate steam engines in the future, and would there be happy offspring? And could we have a theory of evolution for steam engines and for technology in general? He didn't see how to do it, but he was a man of great imagination. All through the 1900s and 1980s, there were speculations about technology, and people did write books. The Evolution of Technologies, one of them came out in the 1980s. But they always ran across the same problem. If you have a theory of evolution for technology, all these theories were assuming Darwin. How do you get a jet engine? We're not quite sure. But in general, technologies come out, they vary, there's different designers, there's different purposes, and then the best designs are selected. There's variations on those designs, further selection, and technology evolves. That's fine. But as I started out, radar was one of the things I was researching heavily, and jet engines. And I thought, you can vary radio circuits all you want. Endless variations, you're never going to get radar. You can vary air piston engines in the 1920s all you want. You're not going to get a jet engine. They work on completely different principles. So all the theories of evolution for technology all borrowed from Darwin, variation and selection, and they all failed because radically novel technologies don't come up from variations on the old ones. Something different was happening. What that was, I was a bit slow to realize, but let me just talk about where do radically novel technologies originate? The origin of technologies. How do we get new species and technologies? And I read and read and read. I keep emphasizing this. All I was doing was trying to read and seeing new principles in technology. And I began to realize that there were some basic principles in technologies, all the technologies I knew of. All technologies, whether they're carbon dating technologies or MRI, that virtually X-rays you, whatever you want to call it, CT scanning, computerized tomography, basically X-ray done in a modern way. All those technologies are put together, they're all combinations. So that was the first thing I observed. Second thing I observed was all technologies are based on some particular phenomenon. Carbon dating was based on the fact that animals absorb carbon, or wood absorbs carbon molecules. When that ceases to be living, certain isotopes start to decay. If you measure the ratio of decayed isotopes to standard carbon, you can date when the thing stopped living. That's a phenomenon, and we use phenomena to get technologies. Third thing, and this for me was a thrill, this is kind of the complexity end of things. Technologies were recursive. And so let me explain that. I got fascinated by the F-35C jet engine. This was 15 years ago. It's just coming out, and I'm sure they're going to sell a bunch of them to Singapore. I don't think they're rushing to sell this thing to Putin or anybody like that, but the F-35C was very advanced technology, and it's a jet fighter. So a jet fighter consists of parts. Now, if properly recursive, you would say a jet engine consists of little jet engines. Put together, it consists of little jet engines. Of course it doesn't. That would be recursive. What I realized was a jet engine is a technology, but it's put together from parts that are also means to human purposes. It's put together from a jet fighter is a technology, a jet engine is a part in that technology. The empennage, the tail and rudder, the rudder and the stabilizers at the back, those are technologies. The avionics, that's the electronics that flies the thing and controls it. That's technology. But you could take each of those apart. The power plant or engine, that's technology. It has a compressor. That's a technology. The compressors have blades. That's technology, etc. So technologies consisted of technologies all the way down. Turtles all the way down. Technologies all the way down. And I began to count the number of layers in a typical technology. Parts that consist of parts, all with purposes. If it had no purpose, it wouldn't be there. It wouldn't be in the technology. And those parts with purposes consist of other parts. So that's recursion. Technologies were fractal in that sense. I don't mean literally in the geometric sense, but symbolically, each technology is fractally made from other technologies that are made from other technologies, perhaps 4 layers down, perhaps 20 layers down, but plenty of layers down. If you look at a piece of electronics these days, it's made up of assemblies that are made of sub-assemblies, that are made up of circuits, that are made up of transistors, that are made up of whatever, right down to individual technologies, individual little pieces, that all using phenomena, and that any technology, given this, is basically putting together phenomena that work. It's really, you might call it a symphony of technologies. If you look at a working jet engine, I'm not sure you should do this experiment in your mind when you're over the middle of the Pacific, but if you do look at a working jet engine, you realize that all these parts have to work together seamlessly, all exploiting slightly different phenomena, all working like a symphony orchestra. And there can be no failure in a technology, or there shouldn't be, or lives are going to be lost. So phenomena, recursion, and combination, those are the key principles. And then so if you start to look at invention that way, where do radically novel technologies come from? I began to realize that I was seeing the same pattern again and again. Typical pattern. And by the way, invention is never explained. There was a school of thinkers about technology in America in the 1920s and 30s, really good ones, people like Gilfillan, Usher, Ogburn. You probably haven't heard of, you might have heard of Ogburn, he's an anthropologist. William Fielding Ogburn. Anyway, they realized that invention was key. They said, well, there's setting the stage. Well, there's realizing something else. And then there comes, boom, a creative insight. Well, that didn't work for me. Everything had a, and then there's a miracle. So I wanted to think of invention with no miracles, no creative insight. As I started to look at more and more and more instances of invention, I realized not very much creative insight. I don't want to say inventors are not creative. It was more a process of problem solving. So let me give you, I don't know, arbitrarily I'll take radar. The year's around 1936, and I'll just take one country. Radar gets invented fairly simultaneously, maybe in Italy, certainly in America, and no doubt here in Singapore. I have no idea, but as I was reminded one time in Russia, then the Soviet Union, you know, people are saying, Professor, you need to realize that this invented in Soviet Union, that invented. And finally somebody was in my side. Guys, it was Yuri Ermolyev. Ermolyev stands up and says, Brian, don't listen. Not all elephants were invented in Soviet Union. Anyway, so radar gets, how does radar get invented? And I'll give you a quick thumbnail story here. Radar gets invented by people, thoughtful people, realizing that that England had a problem. I say England because there was a general idea that bombers, if there were another war, maybe in a few years' time, bombers could come from somewhere, possibly from Germany, and then bomb. How would you know fleets of bombers were coming over, or fighters, fighter aircraft, all propeller driven? At the time they had very acute sense, auditorially acute, I'm not sure what the right word is, people with great ability to your English is probably better than mine, with great hearing ability, blind people. And they built these big concrete walls shaped like parabolas facing the channel in England, and then all the sound would be channeled into something like a gigantic ear trumpet, and the whole thing would go through a cavern and then come out in somebody's ear who's blind, and that way you could hear aircraft about 15 miles away or maybe 20 miles away. It was an incredible piece of technology, but it wasn't good enough. So there was a phenomenon that was known, and that was that if you had high-frequency radio waves, you could bounce it off a piece of metal, even a few miles away, and that would give some sort of echo. So all you had to do, and this is a piece of problem solving, the need was there. Britain realized it needed to detect enemy aircraft, and they realized that what they really needed to do was, if they were going to use that technology, they needed high-frequency radio waves to bounce off the aircraft, and they needed an ability to detect the echo. It wasn't that easy because, and this is where invention comes in. Invention really is seeing a new principle. Oh, we'll use this principle at radio, high-frequency radio waves echo from a piece of metal that interrupts them, and we can detect the echo. That's the principle. But to make it work is pure problem solving. Say, well, we could make that work if we had a source of very high-frequency radio waves. Where are we going to get that? That wasn't solved at the time very well. We could make it work if we can turn off our radio beam within millionths of a second, because any echo is going to get drowned if you're still transmitting. It's as if you're screaming across a canyon or shouting across a canyon, or you won't hear the echo unless you shut up and listen. So they had to switch the circuits, the transmission off within tiny fractions of a second. That takes a circuit they called a duplexer. But notice the general impression I'm giving, or the general way we're looking at this. Along comes a new principle. If we could do such and such, we could do it this way using the principle of radio echoing. What do we need to do that? Oh, well, we need to send out the radio beams. So invention basically is problem solving. There's a need, and you're finding a principle that could solve it, and then you're finding physical apparatus or mathematical ones or whatever to solve all the sub-problems. But then the sub-problems have sub-problems. And then, so this is where recursion comes in. You need to keep solving sub-problems all the way down. If that sounds a bit, it shouldn't sound strange to you, but let me give you a more mundane example. You're standing, it's 1930, you're standing at the foot of Mount Everest, pre-Mallory, and you're looking at the summit and you're saying, it'd be great to climb that. Well, how can we climb that? So we see there's an overall principle. We could go up in the west col, and then we could make our way over, and there'd be this difficulty or that difficulty. So you have a general principle how you're going to do it, but then you realize that part of the route has rock falls, part has steep traverses, other parts have virtual cliffs. And so you split the whole route saying, we could climb the whole thing providing we could climb these subparts. But that's a new problem. How am I going to climb the subparts? And then you see within those subparts, there are other obstacles and difficulties. So how are we going to do that? And really, climbing a mountain or summiting the mountain is very much seeing an overall solution, seeing solutions to the sub-problems, seeing solutions to other problems, sub-problems of the sub-problems, and then putting the whole thing together. I don't want to dwell on this, but I began to realize then that how radical technologies evolved, and this comes back to theory of evolution for technology, is that radically novel technologies like radar, like the jet engine, evolved by someone seeing a new principle and finding in the Lego box of all existing technologies to make it work. How do you find those? Well, sometimes inventions needed to be made to find the right assemblies and parts. So notice that recursion is all the way, there's recursion occurring just about everywhere in putting technologies together. I can solve this if I can solve that. But let me just take a shortcut here and say that no matter how radically novel technologies are made, they're put together from existing technologies, or at least from existing technologies that can be put together from existing technologies. And this leads to the idea of any technology that has a label or a name. Why don't we think of that as a dot? And we can go back to all the technologies that have ever existed since the bow drill or the using fire, and that would be a dot. The Bessemer process, Thomas process, the open hearth process, the basic oxygen. These are all steel making, dot, dot, dot. And then we'll link all the dots by saying the technologies that made any given technology possible. We'll call those the ancestors of that technology. But they have their own ancestors. So let me say, we have the computer. What would be the ancestor of an electronic computer around 1940? Logic circuits. Oh, what's the ancestor of those? Individual logic functions. Oh, how did those come about? People realized that they could use relays to set up Boolean circuits and do, this was Claude Shannon's master's thesis at MIT. You could make relay circuits and you could make logics if you had individual electronic relays, you could make logic circuits. Oh, what gave birth to the relay? Triode vacuum tube. What gave birth to that? And you can go on. So you can develop these ancestries, but what I want you to think about is that each individual technology is a point in this huge space of all technologies ever invented, and then there's ancestries. It's not 2 parents, it might be 5, it might be 20, and then they have their parentage. So all of technology is building out from what's there already. And then we let the nodes light up if they're being active and used. So you imagine all these twinkling lights of the technologies in current use, and then the ones that have gone, those lights are out. But they still exist, and we might still know how to retrieve them, maybe. So that led to the idea, and sometimes these technologies have come into being by capturing new phenomena. You can capture the phenomenon of radio, electromagnetic radiation of energy and detection of that using things like triode vacuum tubes, etc. So that led to this idea that novel technologies do have ancestry in previous technologies, which have ancestry in previous technologies, but it's not variation that counts. It's new combinations that make novel technologies. After that, there may be variations on the theme. And so if you took all these combinations giving rise to novel combinations, you're led to a sort of algorithm or a form of evolution. I called it combinatorial evolution. It's starting to take off, by the way, on the internet, this idea. But the whole idea is this. You start with let's say, a very large Lego set of very primitive technologies. You fiddle around, you make different combinations. This is mankind does, and finds that some of those combinations, possibly by accident, possibly by design, possibly by foresight, some of those combinations work. Okay, you stick them in the oven, you fuse them, and it might be 5 bricks. That becomes a new building block. So the algorithm for technological evolution is not variation, selection, novel species, variation, selection. It's combination, selection of useful combinations, which might be few and far between, and then those get added to the Lego set as building blocks. I was talking about this in Santa Fe one time, and I said, some combinations are pretty obvious, but there's some that aren't. A hen house is a technology. It's a means to a purpose. A jet engine is a means to a purpose. You could combine a hen house and a jet engine. You're not likely to get anything very useful. Then, of course, the wags. Somebody puts up his hand and says, not true. You could you could have the jet engine over here and the hen house there. If you want to get roast chicken very fast. Anyway, perish the thought. But that leads me to saying that if you take the whole collective of technology, all of technologies, all the little lights that are on, and some of the lights and the lights that have gone dark together, technology is self-creating. Novel technologies are created out of previous technologies. If you have a completely novel phenomenon, it could be a quantum phenomenon, like a coming quantum computer, it still has to be realized or created out of the tiny parts or technologies we have access to today or in the future. So technology collectively is a gigantic entity that's adding new nodes. It's a Lego set that's making new things out of building blocks that have been built up in the past. And as that happens, there's more and more technologies. There might be very simple transistors. Then there might be simple transistor circuits until we get the highly complicated electronics we have today. Many, many, many of those building blocks getting used. So there's a multiplicity of building blocks being used again and again in any novel technology. And there's an increase generally in complication. I won't say complexity. So if you want to be fancy, and I thought, okay, this thing's self-creating. And then I remembered there was a word from Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana. I once met Varela at Santa Fe. Lovely guy, died young. And I saw Maturana talk. If I recall right, they're Chilean. At any rate, they had this idea in biology. Maturana's a philosopher. They called it autopoiesis, not autopoiesis, but poiesis, meaning self-creating. So all of technology is a self-creating system, meaning a bit like a coral reef. The new builds upon the old. Completely new species build out of the old. When I say that, people immediately say, oh, what about the human beings? Well, so far human beings are necessary to think up these combinations. So combination is at the center, not so much variation, although it comes in here and there. And all that we see here, the lights, the cameras, whatever, those are combinations of things that were combinations in the past, made out of earlier combinations. And that's where technology evolves. So we now have a theory of evolution for technology. It was pretty obvious. You can think of this as an algorithm then. Start with primitive building blocks of anything. By the way, this applies in mathematics. Primitive building blocks called axioms. You build some mathematical structures out of those and some methods. And then out of those, you can build theorems and lemmas. And out of the theorems and lemmas, you can build more complicated theorems and lemmas. All with tiny bits to connect all these. There has to be some sort of vocabulary. But the vocabulary are elementary pieces of mathematics too. So you're building these big structures. Language works a bit the same. Certainly computer languages work the same. You have elementary operations, and then those become primitive operators like addition or multiplication. Those are put together in other operations that are a bit more complicated, which are put together into a library of subroutines, etc. It could be even a sorting algorithm stored in a library. This led me to thinking, and this was about 2006, could we get our theory of evolution by combination, combinatorial evolution, to work on a computer? And my answer to this was no. My standard research is, I don't know how to do it. I thought for months and months. I ran across a beautiful paper by Rich Lenski and co-workers from Michigan State, and showing using a genetic algorithm to develop more complicated logic circuits. And then I had a co-worker, a colleague. This was Fuji Xerox Palo Alto lab I was working in. A guy called Wolfgang Pollack, who's Stanford-trained computer scientist and really good. And I sat down with Pollack, and we figured out what we could do. So our idea was to take very primitive logic circuits. Don't get freaked out here. These are just, think of these as like little transistors. 2 wires go in. We were going to use a NAND circuit. That's our primitive Lego block, colored yellow, little brick. and there's one thing coming out. It's a not and gate. And we knew, with malice aforethought, we knew that you can construct anything electronic out of NAND gates. So here was our idea. We're going to wire up these primitive NAND gates. We'll wire them randomly. And that's not quite how rail technology works, with people thinking. But we're going to just wire them randomly in the computer. And we're going to have a list of logic functions we would like to see from the combinations created. So we wire them up randomly. And we get silly circuits. They don't do anything. If you use logic gates, by the way, you can figure out what the logic's going to be. If I put 1 here and 0 there, and I know how the logic gate is constructed, I can figure out whether I'm going to get a 1 or a 0. So think of these as little chips, 2 wires in, 1 wire out. We can start to wire the output to another input. We can wire that to 2 more inputs in parallel. We're checking to see what we get out the other end. Mostly we got out nothing. But after about 4 months, Pollack gets the experiment to work. So this is a computer experiment. So think of it this way. Wolfgang Pollack goes home. He has programmed all this up, our algorithm. He hits the return button, and the computer starts putatively. We don't have actual wires, but we have a program that starts to putatively wire these little primitive gates together. And what comes out is that quite useful circuits get created. And we just very primitively, we have a list of circuits we'd be happy to see created. Could we get an implies logic function? Could we get a primitive adder that would add x and y, and then out there you'd get a 0 or a 1 correctly, plus maybe a carry digit. Could we do that? Well, yes. And could we do it automatically? Pollack hits the return button. Over a period of a few hours, some primitive circuits that were useful get made. We throw those back, or at least the computer throws those back into the Lego block. The Lego box, those become building blocks for future circuits, chosen randomly, wired together. That outcome maybe creates nothing, or maybe it creates one useful thing, a bit more complicated now. We toss that into the Lego box in the computer. Now, we're not intervening. Once Pollack hits the return button, actually, he came back 20 hours later to see what fish we had in the net. So we pull the net, he opens it up. I wasn't there for this, but it was his computer. He calls me up the next day all excited. I said, what did you get? He said, you wouldn't believe it. He said, after 20 hours of this algorithm, creating useful things that are very simple, keeping the useful ones among those, wiring those, keeping anything useful that was created randomly by the more complicated things. He says, using that algorithm, he said, we got 4-bit adders. So that's 4 x's going in and then seeing what comes out as doing addition. We got 8, so 4 bits of x, 4 bits of y, and then what the addition was. And it works correctly. And I said, how far did we get in complication? Oh, we got 8-bit comparators, meaning you could have binary digits. And I'm sorry this is getting a bit technical, but hang in there. So you could have a 8-digit number and see if that of x, see if that compared to an 8-digit number of y, and then it'd be a little output that says 1 or 0. Yes, they're the same. No, they're not. So we got 8-bit comparators. We got an 8-bit adder. We got 8-bit exclusive ORs, etc. We got very complicated technologies. And I can remember, he says, we got an 8-bit adder. I said, what? He says, an 8-bit adder? I said, but that's the guts of a 1973 Hewlett-Packard calculator. I don't know if you remember Guaning when that came along. It was a miracle. Yeah, I had one. It was just staggering. You didn't have to do all this in your head. Before that, we had slide rules. So I wouldn't say we developed a Hewlett-Packard calculator, but we developed the key circuitry. Automatically, I'm an electrical engineer. Neither I nor Pollock could sit down and design you an 8-bit adder. It would take me a month to read up on this sort of thing. But we designed an algorithm that could design an 8-bit adder. And we weren't looking for an 8-bit adder. We were just looking for what fish we got in the net, what complicated circuits. So I thought, well, maybe an 8-bit adder is a pretty obvious thing to get. You know, you keep throwing in things. And I was on a plane one time, and I sat down and I thought I'd calculate just how difficult that is. I thought maybe at 1 circuit in a million would add 8 bits or something. So I sat down and did the calculation. 8 bits of X go in, 8 bits of Y go in, and then on the output side, you have 8 bits plus a carry. So that's 9 bits. So you have 16 bits going into this circuit that the computer had created, 9 bits coming out. How many such circuits are there? Well, I did the calculation. I thought there might be 1 billion or something. It could be a large number. Turns out there's 10 to the power of 177,000 such possible logic gates or logic systems. 8 inputs and 16 inputs, 9 outputs. That's a big number. If I were to write that number down, it would take about half a book just to write all those digits down. And within 20 hours, Wolfgang Pollock's computer had found such a thing. So this was a very powerful algorithm, and without giving too much away, I would say that you can't do that easily by Darwinian anything. Because let's vary all the circuits, and if one adds a little bit better, we'll select that. Let's keep varying populations of those. I don't think you'd get to one thing in 177, 10 to the power of 177,000. It's far bigger than the number of elementary particles in the universe, cubed and cubed and cubed or whatever. It's large. So, in fact, I want to just say, and this is off the record, that I have a project in Vienna with Stefan Turner, and we're trying to see now if we could evolve a programmable computer using the same algorithm that I was calling combinatorial optimization. I want to make one last observation here, and that is, all right, I get that combination's important, let's say. I get that the evolution of technology is a matter of combining useful things, selecting out new building blocks, and then using them as elements to make yet more things. So you kind of have a theory of evolution. And I get that invention works as a very refined version of problem solving. But what can you say about innovation in the economy? I could say quite a bit, but I just want to give you one thought, and that is that the way I was taught economics, and this is, I'm not complaining about this, you have to start somewhere, but we think of the economy as a gigantic container, or maybe a gigantic machine. And then every so often, a technology is in this machine and it gets slid out. So you have the Bessemer process. Oh, well, that's outdated. We can now use the Thomas process. Out comes Bessemer process. The new module for the Thomas process is slid in. And so the economy progresses invention by invention. Now that's not wrong, but as I started to look at this, I realized that the economy is not a container for its technologies. The economy is an expression of its technologies. It's technologies that create the skeleton of the economy. That thought is not new. In fact, it occurs in J.S. Mill and Karl Marx, thinkers around the 1850s. They wouldn't have used the word technologies, they would say means of production. So people like Schumpeter, even 50 years later, or quite a bit later, were thinking that an economy is an expression of its means of production. Of course, there have to be accounting and things, but those themselves are putative technologies, and the whole thing has to be held together by institutions, but those are means to human purposes. We can extend our ideas to those too. Well then, and this was, I think I was asked yesterday, how does structural change happen? So let me give you my version. Start to think of an economy as consisting of its technologies with a lot of human action. So technology are the skeleton. There might be a neural system, ideas, and so on. There might be a blood flow, that might be the humans and the trading that goes on. But how does the economy change when a new technology comes along? Standard idea is that a new technology comes along and it's adopted. So the laser comes along, it's adopted. The laser, it becomes part of the laser printer. Laser printers adopted as a printing device. I didn't like that. I think there's something more interesting, more complicated going on, and here's what it is. When I realized that technologies don't come along singly, they come along in bodies of technology. So we have the electronics body of technology. Starting in the 1960s, really, we have genomics. First of all, there are primitive technologies, gene sequencing. There might be plasmids used for inserting genes and producing proteins that way. There might be now gene editing, etc. So a body of technology consists of many, many related individual technologies, and think of those as programming languages. So what really happens is that a new programming language comes along, and I'll take as an example, let's just say AI, and we're really up to date because this is what's happening. So here's your economy, all these technologies getting used in banking or used in trade or used for shipbuilding, and a new technology or body of technologies comes along. It's not adopted. It's encountered. So banking encounters AI. What happens? I was up in Shenzhen last March, and Guaning and I went up there, and I don't think this is giving anything away, but I saw an example of a technology that I thought was very clever, that was getting designed, and that's this technology. You're out, say, in a supermarket, you have your smartphone with you, you say, oh my God, you know, I need another, let's say, $550. I don't have that on me. My bank account's pretty low. Maybe I can get a loan. So you pick up your smartphone. You say, I would like a credit line of $550. Here's where the AI comes in. The AI says, oh, I think that's Brian Arthur, but let me check. So voice recognition kicks in. That's an AI technology. Then say, yep, that's him, we recognize his voice. Okay, let's go into all his accounts and his credit history. More recognition's happening, AI recognition. They need my prior permission to do that. Yep, he's good. Let's look at his current bank account, whether he's paid his bills in the last 2 years. Okay, that's good. And then let's do all the calculations. What's our risk? What's his risk? And all of those. So it's a big conversation among many, many algorithms, many, many machines, comes back to you. 2 seconds later, yes, that's fine. Or, no, sorry, we don't like you, and we'll give you $200, but no more. So it comes back, vump. Notice something that is created from a body of technology, face recognition algorithms, computational algorithms, account checking algorithms. These are all various forms of association algorithms, associative, and I can associate this input with that face, with that person. And then there's all these banking algorithms. Check this account, check that account, and those are all digital. And a melding of the banking technologies and the artificial intelligence technologies gives you a new combination that becomes a new element in the financial business to be used further. I walk into somewhere, in fact, the way things are going, you won't have to walk anywhere. I need a mortgage. I want to buy a 1-bedroom apartment in Palo Alto. Fine. Do I have 1.2 million, which is what that costs, US dollars? Okay, I'd like $1.2 million to buy a 1-bedroom. So our technology then becomes a primitive or a building block in the mortgage thing, and soon we will, standard retail banking, I won't say it will be gone, but it will be heavily diminished. So what I've been giving you here is a guided tour of technology. Yes, I believe there is a theory of evolution for technology. I have a book called The Nature of Technology, and by all means read it there. Taking out a particular algorithm, a building block algorithm, we can say that there's another form of evolution besides Darwin's, and that's called combinatorial evolution, or at least that's the name I gave it. And it looks as if that's possibly going to be important because I can see it, instances of that again and again, and we start to use that for programming, basically putting functions together that lead to further ones, as I was illustrating, say, with the coming of artificial intelligence. There are principles behind technologies, and the centerpiece of all technologies is one operation, and that's combination. Complexity comes in because of all of this recursion, and that kind of gladdens my heart, because every problem you look at might recur in a sub-problem you're looking at. All technologies are fractal. Let me finish here. I promised you at the back, I don't know your name, I think I promised you early on that I'd have some observations on research, if I may. And I want to give 2 observations that I think are just bread and butter. But one observation is think for yourself. And that sounds trite, and it is trite. But think for yourself. Basically, throw out everything that's written. I thought I had a terribly bad habit of trying to figure out things for myself, and then I'd hit the library afterwards. I notice it runs in the family a little bit, but you can think up ideas first and then check them out, as opposed to what. I was once handed a paper, and this is very prevalent in Europe, by what appeared to me a very smart graduate student. She says, would you read my paper? I went off and read the paper. What do you think about it? I said, you're saying what this person thinks about this problem, what that person thinks about it, what this person thinks about what that person thinks. I said, you're correct, but what do you think? And so what I am saying is, please kindly think for yourself. Think experimentally. If you notice, again and again, I've been giving you little thought experiments. People trained, not scientifically, find this difficult. I said to an office mate of mine who's a writer, I said, imagine a world where, gravity is reversed or something. And he's a very, very, very smart guy, and he says, but there can't be such a world. Imagine but there can't be such a world. So, think experimentally. And I want to point out that there's one discipline that I was trained in, and maybe I'm sure you were too, where thought experiment is paramount. It's not obvious. You'd think it's physics, with Einstein thinking this stuff. It's mathematics. You're doing mathematics, at least my version of it is I'm doing mathematics, and I think, how does that work? What would happen if this were infinity? What would happen if I took the limit of this to 0? What would happen if I did this in more dimensions than 2 dimensions? What would happen? The really good mathematicians, and I mean from every century, including Euclid on, are experimentalists. They are using computers or their own imagination or thought experiments. Well, fine. What if we did such and such? Maybe I could call that a group. How would groups work? What would that solve? So think experimentally, and you can wheel up the rigorous stuff afterwards. I'll bet you anything Euclid thought experimentally. Then there's massive tidying goes on, and everything's made to look as totally inevitable, completely obvious, and incredibly smart. But that's not the way people work. If you're doing research, well, I don't know, how would that work? Well, if it isn't evolution in Darwin's way, what could it be? So you keep thinking experimentally. But I want to give you what I call my curly advice. City slickers, the old grizzled cowboy, Curly. This is the deepest part of City Slickers, the movie. The newbies and neophytes are out with this old cowboy, and they're a bit scared of him. But the hero of the movie gets the cowboy Curly on his own, and Curly opens up a bit. And the guy says to Curly, he says, what is your philosophy in life? Curly goes, well, what's that? He says, one thing. And the guy says, what one thing? Curly looks at him and he says, in all of life, there's just one thing that counts. So, what? Curly says, that's for you to figure out. The one thing I want to leave you with, if I may, is this. I did say think for yourself, but I want to say this. If you want to make a real mark on any discipline you're in, observe all you can from the real world. All I was telling you has come from observation of actual technologies. And I sat in St. John's Library in Santa Fe. I raided the stacks in Stanford. I bought books in airports about jet engines. Observe the real world. And then after you've done that, observe the real world. And after you've done that, observe the real world. And then, if you've observed enough, you begin to see commonalities, you begin to see patterns. And I don't want to be grandiose, but that's the way Darwin worked. Somebody asked Darwin late in life, I think this is in his autobiography, Mr. Darwin, do you think you're very smart? They're probably more polite than that. Darwin says, no. He says, well, do you think you're very brilliantly creative? Oh, not really. So what's your secret? This is all very English and very polite. They wouldn't have been that direct. They would say, what do you think lies behind success of your theory of evolution? And Darwin just says, I am a man of enlarged curiosity. What Darwin did above all was he collected beetles, he observed insects, he observed rocks. He went off on the Beagle for 5 years and observed everything he could. He read and observed what other people had to say. And then he comes back and he sits and thinks for about 2 years. I think he comes back around 1836. He's still diddling around in his mind. How could speciation happen? Then I read for amusement one night Darwin, Malthus. I read Malthus, and it struck me that, it struck me that is what you see in all of these accounts, including some of the ones I'm saying what struck me. But this isn't high intelligence. It's reading again and again, and you say, oh my God, this whole thing's about combination. Oh, but then there could be a general algorithm. Oh, well, how would we make the algorithm work on a computer? And maybe there's months in between these things. But I want to leave you with this curly one thing. The one thing is observe the real world first, model afterwards. What's the opposite of that? You model first, or you stuff some rather simplified version of the real world into some tool that you've been shown how to do this or that model. And what you get out the other end, you might be lucky and get something really deep out. More often, this is a bit like creating, making drawing by stick figures. I know how to make a circle, heads are roughly circular. I know how to make a body and there's little arms. But if you observe, you will get very, very good art. And last observation, if I may, just to push this home. When artists first went to Australia, they drew painted trees. Those artists were trained in England in the 1700s. They were masterly. They knew how to paint trees. The trees they painted in Australia were ones where you couldn't see through the foliage. It wasn't until the 1800s that native Australian-born artists started to paint Australian trees, quite often eucalyptus trees, where you would actually see through the foliage, which is the reality in Australia. So what the artists in England had been taught in art school, here's what a tree looks like. Oh, okay, I'll do a tree here in Australia. It's got leaves, it looks fine. They were English trees. That's the bias. So I'm not saying forget all you've been taught. I'm just saying observe like crazy. And after that keen observation, it'll be pretty obvious how things work. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do you want to say a word?
Thank you. Okay, if we now pause. We've heard these 4 lectures. Just offer one comment. I've known Brian for a long time. In those 4 lectures, excuse me, there are lots of nuggets. The 2 things that strike me as I try to put, if I were to write a foreword or an afterword to this series, these are the episodes that I would very quickly note. In the 80s, Brian, as part of this group, creates a group to think about economics, and at that point the challenge is what are the implications of complexity for an out of equilibrium model of economics. What happened was he didn't merely imagine that possibility, which is kind of in the air because of the birth of chaos theory. He came up with the L for all model. He brought people together, and they actually instantiated it. They began to make it possible to use statistical mechanics to investigate the properties of out-of-equilibrium economic systems. That's new. That's changed economics. We see the echoes of that now. So my point is recognizing the challenge of questioning the assumption of equilibrium and then finding a way to actually do it. That was major. That's major. Second major thing, the most important paper in Silicon Valley, Harvard Business Review, we just had the 20th anniversary, increasing returns. Increasing returns is a new theory about how economic systems change, and it changed Silicon Valley. Okay, but now today we've heard something more. It's a different view of evolution, a combinatorial evolution. It's got some roots, I think, as you've acknowledged, with John Holland and genetic algorithms. And here, the immediate implications are a little less clear. Those two phases of complexity economics, those are the building blocks of complexity economics. But it hasn't gone unnoticed. I spent some time last summer with Bill Davidow, he was the guy who was in charge of marketing at Intel at the time when Intel was engaged in a struggle with Motorola over the chip system. Well, anyway, if you think about it for a minute, Motorola has sort of disappeared, I think, completely. They actually succeeded. He's the guy who made that happen. The person that Bill talks about as being the most original and important thinker for his world, Silicon Valley, is Brian Arthur. And what he's interested in is the implications of your notions about the evolution of technology. And that's more wide open. That's more wide open, but it hasn't, no one's really I don't know that anybody has actually really picked up and advanced what the theories that Brian has just outlined for us today. It kind of stands alone, this book on the nature of technology, and a lot of people are intrigued by it, but I don't know of anybody who has really picked it up in the way that his previous major contributions have become part of a major trend in complexity in social science and economics. This stuff is, somehow it's still new, Brian, even though when was the book published?
2009.
2009, so interesting implications yet to be discovered, I think. So with that, I'll just say thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
It's a great series.
I'd very much like to thank
I have two.
Steve for moral support throughout. And sports commentary. Thank you.
All right. We have time for a number of questions.
Thank you again for the privilege of unpacking the messy and beautiful history of it all over the last 4 sessions. I think it's been an honor. 2 quick questions, one fun one serious one. You can decide which is fun. So the first question, how has the science of complexity and systems and everything you've been researching, how has that shaped the way you've developed the science itself? Because the one interesting thing I note about all the things you've been talking about is you reference people all the time. You reference people, you reference interactions with people, you reference random office mates who trigger off new ideas. So there seems to be inherent, it's kind of meta, but it seems to be inherent systems and complexity to the development of complexity itself. So as you've been building up your understanding of this field, has this shaped your own ability to build up the science? Is there a recursive loop here going on? That's the first question. Second question, there are many, but I think the simple one I'll pick was actually, since you mentioned Intel just now, so just yesterday there was a rumor that Apple is dropping Intel as their primary chip manufacturer. It's a rumor. Apparently in 2020, because basically the chip, instead of being something you source from Intel, you now vertically develop in-house. All your chips in your phone now be done by Apple. And as a result, Intel stock dropped 9% when I woke up. That's a huge amount, right? Yeah. So if hypothetically an Intel man were in the room, what could he hear from all your basic principles of technology and evolution of technology for him to, figure out what to do about that?
Which one was the fun question? I'll just say something about complexity. There's many people could answer that better than I could about working with people. But I'll say this, that a lot of the work I was describing on increasing returns was done at Stanford University. And I wasn't using the word complexity. I didn't even know I was doing complexity. And what happened around about 1987, 88 was John Holland came together with me, Stu Kaufman, Chris Langton, several other people. A little later, Steve came along and some others. What I found was that I was learning very, very much in these encounters. I think that a number of people have put together complexity. There's no real theory at the moment. It's more a collection of ideas. The collection of ideas has things like recursion. So you'll see these themes come up again and again. But I'm not too worried that complexity isn't a theory. It's not like the theory of evolution. It's more a collection of commonalities in looking at how patterns unfold and evolve. There's many, many people, and I wanted to give the impression in these talks, I hope I did, that I learned from this people, etc. Stu Kaufman claims he learned about Nash equilibria from economists. Economists learned something else from Stewart, etc. So I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, and that hasn't stopped. In here in NTU, there's a lot of conversation among all of us. So I just think that's normal. As I read the history of science, I notice somebody talked to somebody and somebody else said, why can't we do this? And somebody says, I'm looking at this X-ray photograph, number 51 or whatever it is. That's a helix. Oh, okay. How did you know that? Well, I know about, inverse Fourier transforms or something like that. So it's a collective endeavor. I've never been successful if I set up a team and say, there's now a team. It's much more random. You sit down with someone and say, well, why do you do it that way? The other thing I want to mention is Intel. 1991, I remember sitting in an office, a tiny little cubicle office, with Andy Grove, who was running Intel. And Andy Grove had brought me in because he liked my economics. He said, well, I have a question for you. It's the 383 chip or something. That's about to be reproduced by so-and-so. Is our game over? Now, this was close to 20 years ago. I said, no. You can always invent your way out of that. So I don't want to be too sanguine. I think things like Intel, what I've noticed in Silicon Valley is that you can't stand still. You have to keep reinventing your game, and you can't really look behind you too much. If Apple's making its own chips, which is shorthand for saying they're outsourcing that to China, unless Trump puts, 70% tariff on the chips or something. But I would say that then Intel will go sideways, and everybody in the Valley and Silicon Valley is getting into machine learning and artificial intelligence to the degree that I'm a bit sick of it. We have sensors out there that's bringing in huge amounts of data, huge. They're in your smartphone. There's hundreds of them maybe in your car, all reporting back to something or other. Algorithms then have huge amounts of data to recognize patterns on, and that's changing our economy. And it used to be that we had big data, and I remember seeing a little notice in Park. Dan Ariely, who's a really witty guy and an economist, he said, and this is about 10 years ago, Dan Ariely says, big data, everybody. He says, big data is like sex in junior high. Everybody talks about it, but nobody knows how to do it. But finally, we figured that out, and we're getting artificial intelligence. Where all this goes, I don't know.
I want to make some comments. I think Brian is a very modest guy. I think everybody has noticed that the way he gives the lecture and so on. And I have to say that is actually one of his strengths, because when your modesty is such that you would look at everybody else's idea seriously, and through that you pick out the gems and you follow up on that. I think that is a very important characteristic of somebody who wants to follow in Brian's footsteps. The second quality that I feel is very important, and I think Brian demonstrated that very much, is perceptivity. Being able to perceive interesting combinations and interesting opportunities, and to develop something significant out of that. And I think the third thing that many people should have in order to follow him is the courage. The courage to do something that is out of the ordinary, against the mainstream, and not to be afraid of being characterized as an oddball and so on. And I think Brian has demonstrated these three qualities to us, and I think we would do well for those who are in research to think about these three qualities as we pursue the problems we're trying to solve. There's some comments. I think he's too modest to talk about that.
I can't say anything, except I will say, talking about courage, Guanyin had the courage to bring me here to NTU, so as a kind of slightly different sort of person here in NTU. And I'm leaving tonight, so I've no idea whether my stay for 9 years is over, but it has been really enjoyable, thanks to you, and also to Bertil Anderson, and to Jan and others who I've worked with, more lately Steve, but Jan pretty well all the way along. So thank you.
Okay. Peter Jackson, SUTD. Question is, you offered the prospect that technology will continue to evolve, that currently humans are necessary for it to evolve, but you suggest that we may not always be necessary.
Yeah.
And it seems like the missing piece would be artificial problem definition. Or artificial question posing.
Yeah.
How close are we to that?
Well, I think that's very perceptive. What I talk about a lot in my book, but didn't mention here, is that novel technologies bring along novel needs. As soon as you have an automobile over 100 years ago, then you've needs for oil refining, for oil exploration, for paved roads, et cetera, et cetera. So those are creating needs. They're essentially creating new questions. I don't think we're going to ever be short of questions. Whether we can teach artificially intelligent devices what questions to pose, I don't know. I can imagine we will. For example, we're arriving at artificially intelligent AI algorithms that can do a very good job at looking at radiographic images and diagnosing, oh, here's a lump here, or here's a little nodule here in the brain or wherever. We need to look at that. Now, it's possible for such algorithms to say, here's another pattern that doctors haven't noticed or radiologists haven't noticed, but we have the very fine degree of pattern recognition to recognize that this recurs along correlated with something else. And that would pose new questions. So I do think that there will be new questions posed. I don't think technology is over. Every time I hear reports about it being over in Silicon Valley is over, or why? well, electronics is now outdated, isn't it? I mean, it's all about computation, isn't it? So, no, technology will keep on going. And what amuses me and appalls me at the same time is that we might get algorithms that can design computers. In fact, this is what we're trying to do at the moment. So I do think that technology will march on. But there's one thing I would recommend to any university. We don't need to accept all technologies. We don't need to go down every single path. And what we do need is to match and mirror the miraculous apparition or appearances of novel technologies with an equal and opposite amount of wisdom as to whether we want to develop things. If so, how are we going to develop them? We have very, very strict guidelines for designing tall buildings in seismic areas. We've guidelines for things like aircraft maintenance. So we're not saying any old thing will do. Why shouldn't we have guidelines for exactly the sorts of technologies we want to have in the future? This is where the philosophers on the human side of technology comes in. As of yesterday or 2 days ago, NTU has launched a new initiative in technology, science, and humanity, or humanism. And I think a good start to that would be to say, what do we really want as humans? And we're going to talk about this and we're going to think about it. I don't see why Asia shouldn't lead the way. We haven't done much in the West, and there's a huge repository in this continent of wisdom and a huge degree of skepticism, and why don't we bring that to bear in technology?
Brian, yesterday I asked a question. You perhaps thought I'm trying to be cheeky because I talked about the fake news. Actually, it's not. You think about it. Based on what yesterday lecture, you talk about the non-equilibrium theory in econ and all the others, or even you take the science of complexity. But how does one use all this to discern the quality of information? That's basically my question. Why is that so crucial? A related question is what you talk about today. Be economic systems or technology, increasingly information is a critical ingredient rather than material. So they are related, you see. So if one is able to solve that question I posed yesterday, you have a lot of byproduct. I would like to hear your comment on that. Thank you.
Well, it might be a very good note to end on to say I don't know. I think that I'll try and answer. Again, starting from this idea that I don't quite know, I think let me just put it this way. We've entered an era that I think is unmatched since the coming of an earlier technology, not the steam engine, but printing. When printing was invented in the West, could have been lifted from China, and maybe was, but printing in the West was invented around 1450. And what it meant was that all the information was tightly held in monasteries, in these big books that were handwritten and chained to the desks. Anybody who could read and write or read had access to all that information. Information went public. Where now people say, oh, we're in a new phase of information with artificial intelligence. Not quite. We are in an age where, with artificial intelligence, what has gone public, mirroring what happened in the 1500s and 1450s, what's gone public now is intelligence. It's like the Jeopardy AI thing. I know some of the engineers, you can ask a question, and then all this intelligence, meaning actionable association made among machines using information and data, becomes available. So I'm driving my car, or let's say in Palo Alto, I'm not driving my car. I have a Tesla, I don't. But if I had a Tesla, I push the autopilot button, it's driving itself. Where's the intelligence? Not totally in the car. The intelligence is external. There's all kinds of algorithms, computation, possibly the cloud, all computing, figuring out, given this situation, back to John Holland's if-then thing, in this situation where these pixels are crossing what looks to be a street, maybe it's a dog, do the following. And there's an enormous amount of of external intelligence. 1400s, information goes external. 2000s, intelligence has gone external. And we're now in a new era, and we're getting fed stuff from all that. Increasingly, we can't tell if it's real or fake. And I think that what we're going to be in from here on for a while is an arms race. An arms race between trashy technologies and maybe rather wiser technologies saying this is fake, this isn't. For example, and this is just off the top of my head, you can tell fake stuff quite quickly because it's self-contradictory. Somebody says, whoever, I remember reading that Clint Eastwood was dead. I thought, oh, I like him. What a shame. This is all courtesy of Facebook or something. And then they weren't putting out that, but their advertisers were. And then I read so I Google Clint Eastwood. No sign of death. That's a contradiction. So anyway, I think we are in a new era of information. We're a new era of intelligence, and intelligence has sort of been offshored to the cloud. But it's available. How we use that for fake news, for nonsense technologies, for just sheer rubbish, or whether we use it wisely, it's really up to us. And I think the biggest challenge we have in technology at the moment is not how to create novel technologies. We're good at it in China or here or wherever. But how to create technologies that enhance our humanity, not destroy it. Beyond that, I don't have an answer for you, but I think these are the right questions to ask. Could I just say, before I finish, thousands of thanks to Jan Vassbinder, to Karen, who's never in the room when we thank her. But this was completely and utterly Jan's idea, this set of lectures, and Jan asked me, would I give these lectures? And I said, well, I'm not Sidney Brenner. Jan says, it doesn't matter. He said, you can tell a story. So thank you, Jan.
Well, I think you did great, and I'm very glad that we pursued the idea.
Thank you.
And I think this is a good moment to stop. But I will not stop without telling you what we will do with these lectures. First of all, they're all videotaped, so they will appear on internet at some point. You'll know about it. Then we want to make a book out of it. So we will transcribe the lectures. We will add a preface and an afterword or whatever, and we'll publish it. But in order to make it a good book, we want to have your feedback as well. And that's why I asked in an earlier mails to you to make a short report of these lectures. And that doesn't mean that you have to summarize everything that Brian said. It is really putting in one paragraph or maybe one page, whatever length you want to choose, in your own words and in totally as you think. What did you take away from these lectures? What do you think is worthwhile for others to know about it? And that we will compile and put in the book as well. So having said that, I think and that's all going to happen pretty fast. To tell you that we just, as Brian already mentioned, Sidney Brenner, we did a similar series for Sidney Brenner. I think it was in December. Karen, was that right? In December, anyway. The book is now almost finished, so you'll see it coming somewhere hopefully this year still. I think that is a nice way to stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much, but most specifically thank you, Brian, and thank you, Steve, for helping summarize here and there and asking good questions.
Color
And of course,
commentary.
Karen, who just peeps around the corner now. And maybe we give one big applause to Brian and all ourselves.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good.